If your dog ignores you sometimes, especially when you're calling their name, giving a command, or trying to get their attention, it can feel confusing in a way that's hard to explain. Because one moment they seem deeply connected to you, responsive, affectionate, almost as if they understand everything you say, and then suddenly, it's like you don't exist at all. You call them once, twice, maybe even louder the third time, and they simply keep sniffing the ground, staring at something invisible, or walking in the opposite direction as if your voice never reached them, which often leads to a very natural conclusion that most owners quietly arrive at. My dog is being stubborn, or worse, ignoring me on purpose. But here's the truth that most people don't realize, and it changes everything about how you interpret that moment. Your dog is not ignoring you in the way a human would ignore another human, because dogs don't operate with the same social intentions, emotional strategies, or even the same understanding of what responding means, and what looks like disobedience on the surface is often something much more subtle happening underneath. In many cases, your dog is actually responding perfectly, just not to you. They may be responding to the environment, to a scent you cannot perceive, to a sound outside your hearing range, or to an internal state that, at that moment, is more powerful than your voice, which means the real issue is not that your dog doesn't respect you, but that something else has temporarily become more relevant in their world. And once you begin to see that clearly, the entire dynamic between you and your dog starts to shift in a way that is both surprising and deeply practical. To understand why your dog seems to ignore you, you need to step into their sensory world for a moment, because what feels like a simple situation to you is, for them, layered with levels of information that you are not even aware exist, and this difference alone already explains a large part of the disconnect. While you rely heavily on vision and language to interpret the world, your dog is primarily guided by smell, movement, and environmental signals, which means that when they are outside, or even near an open window, they are processing an overwhelming stream of scents, each one carrying detailed information about other animals, people, territory changes, and even emotional states left behind in the environment. So when you call your dog while they are deeply engaged in sniffing the ground, what you are really doing is trying to interrupt a highly stimulating investigation that, from their perspective, is not only interesting but biologically important, and this makes your voice compete with something that is naturally more compelling to them. And it doesn't stop at smells. A distant noise, a subtle movement, or even the anticipation of something they've learned to expect in that context can completely shift their attention, pulling them into a state where your command becomes background noise rather than a priority signal. This is why repetition often makes things worse instead of better, because each time you repeat a command without a response, your voice loses clarity and meaning, gradually blending into the environment instead of standing out from it. If you've ever felt like your dog listens perfectly at home but becomes a different animal outside, this is not a coincidence. It's a direct reflection of how context reshapes their attention and decision-making in real time. And once you recognize what you're actually competing with, you stop taking it personally and start seeing it for what it really is, a matter of relevance, not defiance. If you've ever noticed your dog behaving one way at home and completely differently outside, it might be worth paying attention to these patterns more closely, because understanding them is often the first step toward building clearer communication and a stronger connection over time. There is a moment, subtle but constant, happening inside your dog every time you give a command, and most people never notice it because it doesn't look like hesitation or rebellion. It looks like nothing at all. Yet it is one of the most important processes shaping your dog's behavior. Your dog is evaluating, not in a complex, human, overthinking way, but through a fast, experience-based system that weighs what you're asking against what they are currently feeling, sensing, and expecting, which means that when you call them and they don't respond, it's often because, in that exact moment, something else has a higher value in their internal scale. This could be curiosity, excitement, uncertainty, mild stress, or even a learned expectation that staying where they are has been more rewarding in the past than coming back to you, especially if previous interactions unintentionally reinforced that pattern. And this is where things become uncomfortable, but also incredibly useful. Because the truth is, many dogs are not ignoring their owners. They are simply choosing what makes more sense to them based on their past experiences, their current emotional state, and how consistently communication has been reinforced over time. If coming when called sometimes leads to the end of fun, the leash going on, or the environment becoming less interesting, your dog quietly learns that responding is not always the best option, even if they understand exactly what you're asking. So what looks like disobedience is often a decision shaped by patterns you didn't even realize you were creating. And once you accept that your dog is not just reacting, but constantly making small decisions everything changes, because now the question is no longer why is my dog ignoring me, but what has my dog learned that makes this choice make sense? Once you understand that your dog is constantly making small decisions based on relevance and past experiences, it becomes impossible to ignore the role you play in shaping those decisions, because whether you realize it or not, your behavior is always teaching something, even in the moments where you think nothing is happening. Dogs are exceptional pattern detectors, and they don't need formal training sessions to learn, because they are continuously associating actions with outcomes, tone of voice with emotional context, and commands with consequences, which means that every interaction you have is quietly reinforcing a version of reality in their mind. If you call your dog multiple times and they only come on the fourth or fifth attempt, what they are actually learning is not come when called, but respond when it feels necessary, and over time this creates a flexible rule instead of a reliable one. If your tone changes from calm to frustrated, your dog may begin to associate your voice with pressure rather than clarity, which can lead to hesitation instead of cooperation, especially in environments where they are already stimulated or uncertain. And perhaps most importantly, if responding to you consistently leads to something neutral or even negative, while ignoring you allows them to continue engaging with something rewarding, the balance naturally shifts in favor of ignoring, not because your dog is challenging you, but because the outcome is simply more appealing. This is why consistency is not just a training principle, it is the foundation of how your dog interprets reality. Because without it, commands lose meaning, signals become ambiguous, and your presence competes on equal terms with everything else in the environment. When you start to see your behavior as part of the equation rather than separate from it, you gain something incredibly powerful: the ability to influence your dog's choices without force, simply by changing the patterns they experience. Once you truly understand that your dog is not ignoring you out of stubbornness, but responding to what feels most relevant in the moment, the solution stops being about repeating commands or trying to impose control, and starts becoming a process of making your presence, your voice, and your cues consistently meaningful in your dog's world. This doesn't happen through intensity, and it doesn't happen through frustration. It happens through clarity and consequence, built over many small interactions that, when repeated over time, reshape how your dog evaluates each situation. It begins with reducing unnecessary repetition, because every time you say a command and it is ignored without consequence, you are unintentionally teaching your dog that responding is optional, which weakens the signal you are trying to build. It continues with becoming more aware of timing, because calling your dog when they are already deeply engaged with something highly stimulating often sets both of you up for failure, while choosing moments where their attention is more available allows you to reinforce the behavior with much greater success. And most importantly, it requires creating outcomes that make sense from your dog's perspective, where responding to you leads to something positive, engaging, or at the very least neutral, instead of consistently marking the end of something they value. Because in the end, your dog is not asking, "Should I obey?" in the way we tend to imagine. They are constantly, quietly asking, "What matters most right now?" And your role is not to eliminate everything else that competes with you, which would be impossible, but to gradually become part of what matters, through consistency, awareness, and interactions that build trust instead of tension. When that shift happens, the moments where your dog seems to ignore you begin to fade. Not because you force compliance, but because, in their world, choosing you simply starts to make more sense.